Hi, my name is Tess, and I was just welcome all to our second annual Juneteenth commemoration. And just for those of us that forget and don't know, Juneteenth is our newest national holiday, of course, but it's celebrating the emancipation of African American enslaved people on June 19th, 1865. So I would also like to thank Michael Cartwright, who is going to be our second presenter at the evening, for getting this started here in the library. He presented for us last year and suggested that this become an annual event, and has also been instrumental in providing topics for our second annual event. So I really appreciate that. It's been a wonderful thing to get started, and we hope to build on it and continue. And so I'm really pleased to see all of you here. I've said enough, and I'd like to introduce you to your first speaker, Rachel Perry.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And it's like a full house, and that's a wonderful thing for this celebration, if you will. I'd like to thank the Brown County Library for hosting the event, and also Michael Cartwright for inviting me to participate. It just occurred to me that I wasn't talking into the microphone. Oh, wow. I want to give a shout out to Saban Guy, who is the great niece of John Wesley Hardrick and the family archivist, and her son Tracy James for providing family photos and helping me with research. Much of my information has come from a catalog titled A Shared Heritage by William E. Taylor and Harriet Warkle. So this is a photograph of the Hardrick family with their mother. The top row is the mother, Georgia West, and next to her is her eldest daughter, Naomi Hardrick. And then on the front row from left to right is Georgia, the Georgia Jr., I guess, Hardrick, Shepherd Hardrick, Sumner Hardrick, and then John Wesley is on the far right, looking kind of sad. He was born in 1891 and he died in 1968. He was a significant artist in his own time. He painted more portraits of Indianapolis African Americans than any other artist then or now. He came from a landowning family of proud heritage in Kentucky. Shepherd Hardrick, John's grandfather, farmed his own land after the Civil War. In 1871, the Hardricks were threatened by white supremacists who said they were going to burn down the farm and gave them 24 hours to leave. So the family quickly packed up and headed north, and they settled on the southeast side of Indianapolis. And this is a photograph of Hardrick's mother. John showed early talent for drawing by the age of 6, and he allegedly taught himself to work with watercolors a few years later. His sister Georgia remembered him sketching and drawing whenever he wasn't occupied in class or busy with other activities. And as the oldest boy, he would have shouldered much responsibility. According to grandniece Saban Guy, she said, quote, "Everyone was dignified in the old days. They had religion. The moral compass was high." John's aunt owned a resort at Lake Okobozier outside of Des Moines, Iowa, where the family visited in the summers. Legend has it that John, at age 15, made sketches of a monument erected in memory of local white pioneer families killed by Indians and sold them for 25 cents a piece. They sold as quickly as he could make them. And of course, in this photograph, John's on the far right. This photo, I think, might have been taken when John graduated from elementary school. He went to Harriet Beecher Stowe School, and there was a teacher there that was so impressed by his drawings that she took them to Herman Lieber. And any of you in the art world know that Lieber owned the Indianapolis art supply store, H. Lieber Company. When Hardrick finished primary school in 1905, Lieber convinced his parents to enroll him in classes at the John Herron School of Art. Saturday classes he took for 2 years. At the time, Herron, like the city's high schools, was integrated. Crispus Attucks High School was not built until 1925, when Indianapolis took a giant step backward. And this is a self-portrait that Hardrick did. He attended Emmerich Manual Training High School, where the principal art instructor was Hoosier Group artist Otto Stark. He learned more rendering skills under Stark and also began using oil paint. He began entering his artwork in the Indiana State Fairs, winning awards for 8 of them when he was 19. Excuse me. Enrolling in regular classes at Herron in the fall of 1910, Hardrick's first instruction in drawing and painting was with another Hoosier Group artist, William Forsyth, and Forsyth's friend Clifton Wheeler. He took classes at Herron for 8 years, receiving a scholarship in the year 1913-14. Money was always a struggle for Hardrick. He married Georgia Anna Howard in 1914. He worked nights at the Indianapolis Stove Foundry and continued selling newspapers, which he'd been doing early every morning since high school. As a carrier for the Indianapolis Star, he won a $500 Monroe Roadster in 1915 by adding 251 new subscribers during a contest. Hair care entrepreneur Madam C. Walker, whom he painted, helped him sell the automobiles so he could put the money toward his education. He had his first major exhibition at his family church, Allen Chapel AME, in January of 1914, where he displayed 43 oil paintings, 8 watercolors, and 6 drawings in pastel, charcoal, and pencil. In an accompanying brochure, Hardrick wrote, quote, "The object of the present exhibition is an attempt to stimulate an interest among colored citizens of Indianapolis to encourage art, to inspire, if possible, some young, talented boy or girl to realize that life without labor is a crime and labor without art is brutality." The Indianapolis Association of Colored Men commissioned Hardrick to paint portraits of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass for a celebration honoring the two leaders. The paintings were then given to the Senate Avenue YMCA, which has since disbanded. The Senate Avenue YMCA was the African American YMCA in Indianapolis. They were segregated. Critical acclaim was given to Hardrick when he exhibited with William Edward Scott in the 10th annual exhibition of works by Indiana artists in the spring of 1917. He graduated the following year and later shared a studio at 542 Indiana Avenue with fellow artist Hale Woodruff. And this is a picture of Hale Woodruff. While still painting, Hardrick worked in the family trucking business and started a carpet cleaning business. In 1927, his work was included in the Art Institute of Chicago's exhibition of African American artists, and he also showed his paintings at the Pettis Gallery inside the Washington Street dry goods store. And this is a picture in 1921 taken by the W.H. Bass Photo Company, and it belongs to the Indiana Historical Society. The New York store on East Washington Street was an Indianapolis fixture for more than 70 years, catering mostly to women shoppers. The store had its origin in a single room of the Bates House in 1853, moving to 33 East Washington Street about 1860. It really wasn't uncommon in those days for department stores to have galleries to show artwork. Perhaps the most famous of Hardrick's paintings is this one titled Portrait of a Young Girl or Little Brown Girl. He won the second place bronze medal for distinguished achievement in the field of fine arts from the Harmon Foundation for this painting, along with 4 others. To acknowledge Hardrick's achievements, several Indianapolis Black churches, clubs, lodges, sororities, and fraternities raised funds to purchase this painting to donate it to the Art Association of Indianapolis, which later became the Indianapolis Museum of Art Newfields. 15 years later, the museum noted that it was missing from their inventory. It was found at a New York dealer's in 1993, and its return was negotiated. Files at the museum indicated that in 1940, the painting was loaned to a Wallasey hotel that closed a few years later. So this painting was being created in 1928 for the new Allen Chapel AME Church in Indianapolis, but the canvas was stolen from Hardrick's studio before it could be installed. So he repainted it on a much larger canvas and attached it to the wall at the balcony level to prevent theft. Titled, quote, Christ and the Samaritan Woman at the Well, a conflation of 2 different Bible stories I've since discovered. The artwork took between 30 and 40 hours to complete. Hardrick spent 5 to 8 hours each night on the mural after working all day in the family trucking business. The artist used his imagination to render the figures in the composition. And this painting, you might see there's it looks like a crack down the middle, which I don't know if they moved the painting and they couldn't get it through the door or what happened, but it's in dire need of restoration, and I'm hoping to spearhead a project to get that done as long as Pastor Bacon goes along with this. This is a photo of Hardrick from about 1927. Having developed a formidable reputation as an artist, Hardrick began receiving small grants from the Harmon Foundation. In response to a questionnaire requesting information about him, John Patton, who was the owner of John A. Patton Funeral Home and very active in the Senate Avenue YMCA, wrote, quote, in spite of his acute poverty, this young man has the faculty of discerning beauty in everything, being able to face all of his adversity with a smile that conceals the feelings within. At the same time, he possesses a personality which strangely draws people to him. Hardrick continued to make ends meet with his day job while painting whenever possible. Sometimes his jobs converged, like on a July day in 1933, when the Indianapolis Star chronicled how he sped away from his exhibit opening to organize the distribution of coal and then finish the portrait commission. Hardrick painted many portraits in the 1920s and 30s, including this one of his daughters, titled Dolly and Rach. He had married young, and his family grew quickly to include Rowena, Raphael, Georgia, and Rachel. This is a painting of Rachel at about age 11, seated on a sofa holding the arm of her standing sister, Georgia, obviously dressed for a special occasion. Perhaps Rachel is advising her younger sister about her behavior. Hardrick became the most prominent Black portrait artist in Indianapolis and was chosen to depict Xenia Goodloe, a notable dress designer and the wife of the head baker at the L.S. Ayers department store downtown. Her husband's Lady Baltimore Cakes, an American white layer cake with fluffy frosting and fruit and nut filling, were considered prized culinary treasures. Likely wearing a gown of her own design and simple, elegant jewelry, the sitter looks relaxed as she casually holds a filmy handkerchief. By leaving out extraneous detail, Hardrick focuses attention on the sitter, accentuating her face by a lighter background color. Hardrick, occasionally approached people on the street and asked if they would be willing to sit for a portrait. He chose these non-commissioned portrait subjects for their grace, charm, beauty, and poise. This woman's direct gaze suggests that she's forthcoming and comfortable with herself. Like Little Brown Girl, the artist used flowers and foliage in the background to enhance the figures. Enjoying the challenge of painting silk, fur, and chiffon, Hardrick used a sensitive touch to render the soft texture of the sitter's dress with ruffled sleeves. He conveys the young girl's vulnerability and innocence with this full-faced portrait, and the person is Ella Mae Moore in 1933. In 1921, 31, and 34, Hardrick's artwork was accepted in the juried Hoosier Salon exhibitions. Paintings with titles Golden Glow, Child of the Wildwood, The Light of the World, No Sa, and Auntie were likely sold and have not been located. Although he considered himself primarily a portrait artist, Hardrick began painting landscapes. According to Judith Newton and Carol Weiss in their History of the Hoosier Salon, he traveled to Brown County several times. At the peak of autumn season, when the leaves were at the height of their color, during the summer, when the sun was bright and hot, and in the winter, when the ground was covered with snow. And this is the snow scene that's at the Indianapolis of Art now. He did not sketch during these visits, but took in the different scenes and committed them to memory. Primarily following in the footsteps of his teacher, William Forsythe, Hardrick worked in an impressionistic style. In order to capture a feeling of spontaneity, he liked to work very quickly. He revealed that he generally rose before breakfast to begin work on a landscape composition that he'd visualized the night before. Starting at the top of the canvas, he began with the sky overlapping the paint as he worked toward the foreground. He did not like to rework his paintings, so he rarely spent more than 2 days on a landscape. Since most of his landscapes are undated, it's impossible to know when the artist came here. The genesis of this program was the question of how John Wesley Hardrick managed to come to Brown County during Indiana's harshest period of racial restrictions. Known as the Sundowner Town, when blacks were required to be out of the county by dark, Nashville and Brown County condoned the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s and 30s. The Brown County Democrat carried a story on Christmas night, 1922, about a large cross 18 feet tall that was wrapped in burlap, soaked in kerosene, and set afire on the hill just north of Nashville. And that just happens to be right across the street from where I now live. 6 months later, the Democrat reported that a Klan parade took place in Nashville to recruit Brown County members. After researching the question of Hardrick's visit to the county, the most plausible explanation, which came from Brown County Historical Society archivist Barbara Livesey, is that he was friends with Fred Hetherington, artist and supporter of the arts, and a cohort with Carl Lieber, the son of Herman Lieber and chairman of the Fine Arts Committee at Heron Art Institute. Hetherington bought this cabin that you're looking at on Jackson Branch Road in 1907 and owned it until his death in 1931. He may have brought Hardrick down to his place, which had a structure and back for guests. The cabin would have been away from the town of Nashville and not the focus of attention. So now we get into some of Hardrick's paintings that he did in Brown County. His landscapes amplify lush foliage and the warm sunlight, expressing his reverence for nature. Uncommonly, Hardrick includes humanity in his landscapes, showing a farmhouse nestled among the hills or a horse-drawn wagon. Typical of Hardrick's compositions, this river scene shows off his skill of reflecting the shoreline in the water to enhance the illusion of a wet surface. The fading color of the foliage in the background creates depth, using the famous Brown County atmospheric haze. And this painting is called Haymakers, and you can just see down here the image of a cart with hay on it and a horse. The soft, fluffy clouds in the late summer day make this landscape from Hardrick's imagination far removed from his city life. According to John Hewitt, who was an art collector, Hardrick often allowed the paint to flow down the canvas and concentrated on its expressive qualities rather than trying to represent accurately. He also preferred blending his own colors and avoiding premixed formulas, using a distinctive palette. Combining imagination with observation, Hardrick created canvases that vibrated with color and light. And this is my favorite Hardrick painting. It's a winter scene. I really like it for its peachy background sky and snow-covered trees. In July of 1932, the Harmon Foundation returned one of Hardrick's loaned paintings titled Lady X via Railroad Express. Hardrick was so hard up that he couldn't pay the express cost of $4.47. In correspondence with Evelyn Brown at the Harmon Foundation, it was discovered that the painting had never been picked up after 9 months, and the express company's storage charges had accumulated to $13.47. The Harmon Foundation offered to pay the fee and keep the painting in New York until Hardrick could reimburse them, but there's no record of what happened to the painting. The Public Works of Art Project was established in 1933 to help give artists employment. Hardrick was hired as one of 4 artists selected for the project planning committee. He was also hired to paint murals for the spaces on each side of the Crispus Attucks High School auditorium. Hardrick, like many artists at the time, was painting in what became known as the regionalist style, which favored well-defined shapes and narrative scenes featuring urban settings and industrialism, and the everyday lives of common man. Hardrick created the image of a line of black men pouring molten steel into casks at the foundry, a familiar scene to him. The men wearing goggles, caps, and sleeveless t-shirts are clearly concentrating on their perilous task. According to descendants, Hardrick's intended message was to emphasize the importance of staying in school in order to avoid hard labor. But the principal of Crispus Attucks at the time, Dr. Russell A. Lane, didn't see it that way. Perhaps he preferred blacks to be represented in more distinguished circumstances. Previously a faculty member of the English department, Dr. Lane allegedly rejected the completed mural, and it languished in the school basement until lost or discarded. Though the mural was never found, it's likely similar to this easel painting of ironworkers that was painted around the same time. In keeping with the regionalist style of painting common scenes, one can almost feel the blowing snow as a group of people line up to board a city bus. The artist renders the figures using only a few brush strokes, concentrating on gestures rather than features. Sometimes, Hardrick took his easel to downtown Indianapolis and painted on location as people watched. One of the first plein air painters. He often sold the still wet, newly finished work and then immediately put up another blank board to begin again. This is one of his quickly painted works, capturing the flurry of people returning home after work or shopping. In an impressionistic style, these quick creations reflect loose spontaneity. The misty atmosphere almost obscures cars and buildings, but the viewer can make out the Hugh Manser building, which was a prominent office complex on Ohio Street. It was demolished in 1980. And this is a portrait of Wallace Wall that was painted around 1940. Despite his notoriety as an artist, Hardrick continued to work various jobs to make ends meet, including driving a taxi cab. He often sold paintings out of his trunk. This is a portrait of Wallace Waugh, a black barber who had a shop in the aforementioned Hugh Manser building for 47 years. He cut hair for many famous people, including Thomas Marshall and Charles Fairbanks, both vice presidents of the United States, authors Boothart Tarkington and Meredith Nicholson, and musicians Hoagy Carmichael and Roland Hayes. He was the private barber for J.K. Lilly and was driven every Sunday morning to the Lilly home on Sunset Lane in the 1940s and 50s. Hardrick drove Mr. Waugh to and from work and also drove his daughters to school. His portrait may have been painted in trade for haircuts. Although Hardrick painted a diverse group of Indianapolis residents, his most sensitive portraits are of the city's African-American community. In his many portraits of Black citizens, the artist documented an elite group to whom he looked for cooperation and encouragement. This particular portrait I found, but I was unable to actually identify it. But I think it could possibly be a portrait of John Patton. Hardrick won numerous awards for these portraits, many of which are difficult or impossible now to locate. It's known that he painted images of prominent Black citizens, Madam Walker, First Crispus Attucks principal Matthias Wilcox, jazz vocalist Maxine Sullivan, as well as white citizens, including Dr. C.J. Winders, minister of the American Church Federation. So this is kind of an anomaly. I never found any other paintings that were like this. It may have been a commission or just a stab at a different subject matter that was selling at the time. John Hardrick's wife, Georgia, died in 1941, and he moved into his parents' house on Prospect Street, where 3 of his children also lived. He used the attic for his studio. Hardrick may have set up his still life as a way to paint without going out. It's also the only still life I've seen. Beginning in 1946, he used the basement of Emily and Rufus Wharton for his studio and residence. He began suffering from symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And this is a photo, I think, around 1960, of Hardrick on the far right with many of his relatives. Arthur Tucker and Stephen Buckner remember their grandfather loved vanilla wafers and steak and watching All My Children. Hardrick delighted in being a jokester, the kind who tickled Tucker's face with a blanket to wake him up. When they were in public, their grandfather was famous enough that people would stop him to talk. Once on a walk, the artist fell, and a stunned young Tucker saw a man come out of nowhere to pick him up and drive him home. Toward the end of Hardrick's life, Parkinson's disease slowly stole his remarkable abilities, but it couldn't erase his decades of work that were so important to the community. John Wesley Hardrick died on October 18, 1968, and is buried at Crown Hill Cemetery next to his wife for 25 years. A major exhibition and catalog at the Indianapolis Museum of Art included John Wesley Hardrick with William Edward Scott and Hale Woodruff in 1977. Look for an article about Hardrick in the Indiana Historical Society's Traces of Indiana Midwestern History magazine, and a possible exhibit of his paintings at the Indiana State Museum in the next year. Thank you for your undivided. Questions? Oh, way in the back there. Hi.
Yeah, is there still much interest or any marketing on this painting?
Oh, yes. There is interest in Hardrick's work. Within the last, I'd say, 10 years, there's been very much increased interest in artwork by African American artists, and Hardrick's no exception to that. And you can still find work of his in auctions occasionally. And, it's kind of luck of the draw. The only thing is some of the paintings might not be in great shape. So, when you're buying one, you might want to go look at it first. Okay, thank you, and I'm gonna, yes, Michael?
The murals at Christmas Attics, did I understand you say that he was the painter or one of the painters?
Oh, he was the painter. He painted the murals at Christmas Attics. There were 4 artists that were hired to, manage the artists at that time. But he was the one that was hired for the Christmas Attics murals, and it was, I think, he didn't do a lot of paintings where he made social statements. And he was really just, he wanted to create beauty, and he was really interested in the character of the people he was painting. But I think this was probably a really, really disappointing experience for him. And I don't know how or why this easel painting showed up. It belongs to Bob and Ellie Hahn up at the Hahn Museum of Art in Lafayette. But I'm just assuming that it was a similar subject matter.
So there are no photographs or any artifacts of the mural?
No, this is all just history from the family. That this is something that happened. Yeah.
Well, after recent controversy in the Minneapolis Museum of Art about community inclusiveness and changing the administration and changing the name and everything, it seems like they would be trying to exhibit more of his work. Are there any of his works on exhibit there now?
Really, I don't know the answer to that question. But they do have 3 paintings, and thank you. Is there one more question?
Rachel, I just wanted to know if any of his children became artists following his footsteps, or any other creative professors.
I don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't think so. They probably saw this brother. Thank you very much.
Thank you for allowing us that short break while we switch over. And I would also like to introduce Michael Cartwright as our second presenter. And he's talking about the Black settlers of Brown County. So, welcome.
Thank you. So I retired less than 6 months ago from the University of Indianapolis, and I'm afraid I haven't yet recovered from a lifetime of academics that includes the throat clearing that scholars do in the midst of their anxiety. So an interim report here is simply meant to indicate that I'm not the first to go down this road, and I trust I won't be the last. I don't know as much about this topic as some might know, but I know more than most people who haven't bothered to look at it yet. So there is an important quest to remember the Black settlers of Brown County, and I do hope that that is something that will become associated with the Juneteenth celebration. It ought to be at least one occasion a year in which the settlers who were Black are remembered and something of their heritage is celebrated and received. So there are different ways to go about a quest to learn. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 and afterward, Rachel Perry collaborated with Joe Schroeder to bring to visibility the stories of people of color in Brown County. A couple of really fine articles that were published in the Brown County Democrat in July of 2021 that sort of awoke me from my slumbers about the need to explore these things more. And some of you who attended last year's Juneteenth celebration may recall that I mentioned the work of a brilliant young historian named Annalisa Cox. And once again, I brought along copies of her books, and I'll pass them around. And I would encourage you to perhaps get interlibrary loan copies or borrow them one way or another to learn more about her research. But I'm going to offer just a few comments about her work as an example of what could yet be done. So her first book, The Bone and Sinew of the Land, was the result of more than a decade of research about Black settlements in the Midwest, the area that once comprised the old Northwest Territory. She found 338 distinct settlements of Black settlers in the areas that now comprise Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And that includes at least one in the area of Brown County. So number 140 on her list of 338 represents the Black settler in Brown County. And she had a very precise definition that she used: a settlement with at least one African-American owned farm, no larger than 199 acres, with property valued at less than 199. That's what one of those circles represents. And she had 3 other designations with more than one marker that indicated the larger groupings. There were 92 such settlements in the state of Indiana before the Civil War. So she's looking at the period from 1800 to 1860. Number 140 on the map designated the one African-American settler in Washington Township in Brown County, Indiana. Now, this is not the only African-American living in Brown County. It's the African-American who met her criteria. And the criteria is important because under that definition, the settler in question, under the rules of the 1787 Northwest Ordinance and other rules, would have been a full citizen because of being a property owner, and therefore eligible to exercise voting and so on. As I trust you know, those rights were revoked progressively in Indiana and elsewhere, but she's using a definition that would have conveyed full citizenship at the time of the territory. She later went on to write a wonderful study of a mixed race community in Deerfield, Michigan, now known as Covert, Michigan, a small town in Van Buren County, southern Michigan, and along the Lake Michigan, in the period after the Civil War. And it's a hopeful story about how people lived side by side for 50 years after the Civil War. And I would stress, and she would stress, that while it's a hopeful story, it's not an idealized community. It's about ordinary people living in ordinary conditions. And Annalisa Cox is, I think, devoting her life as an independent scholar to this kind of work. And I'll be interested to see what additional things she's done. But based on the first 20 years of her life work, this is quite remarkable. So the second book is called A Stronger Kinship. And it takes its title from a Richard Wright line that is really well worth pondering. The differences between black folk and white folk are not blood or color, and the ties that bind us are deeper than those that separate us. The common road of hope which we have all traveled, has brought us into a stronger kinship than any words, laws, or legal claims. And clearly this is someone who has been inspired by literature, the arts, poetry. So I am not suggesting to you that we are in a position to tell that kind of story in Brown County. Our circumstances are different. Even so, historians are recovering stories of Hoosier communities that are small and ordinary, and I think we should take heed of that. The one that I'm in particularly taken with is called A Rosetta Stone on Slavery's Doorstep by Mark Allen Furnish. He's reconstructed the story of what happened in Lancaster Township in rural Jefferson County, where Blacks and whites founded Eleutherian College in the 1850s. It's a stunning piece of scholarship that he wrote over a period of 8 years, kind of a blue-collar scholar. We call the hard work of doing work with public records, oral history, and it's an amazing story. Some of you know that the building of the Eleutherian College still exists. One of the very few abolitionist colleges in Indiana, and quite a fascinating story associated with it. But again, ordinary people, ordinary life, doing stuff that most people are not doing, namely mixing in the context of education. These kind of histories are based on records that were established in the 1850s and 1860s. The registries of Negroes and colored people, they were called. There are different kinds of population density that are concerned with these. Along the Ohio River, the population of free Negroes in 1850s in Jefferson County was 163. And the reason we know anything about these people at all is because they were required by law to be registered after the 1851 state constitution, Article 13, and the 1852 law indicating that free Negroes could not live in the state of Indiana unless they had lived there prior. And Bartholomew records list a total of 58 persons. I've looked at the list of the 58 persons. It's quite striking. Most of them come from one family, the Blanks family, but all of them required a white person to actually testify to the veracity of the identifications of the persons, and these were for the purposes of surveillance. And I'll give an example here in a moment. We know that very few Blacks lived or settled in Brown County, but I would urge you not to think that the number was ever zero. The historical record for Brown County is difficult to establish, in part because there are obscuring factors, including a page or two in the 1877 listings where someone listed the names in the wrong column, apparently because it was used so infrequently to record the names of white people, and they later went back and crossed those names out that were listed initially as colored. But there are African Americans that can be named and that I would encourage us to continue to learn more about. So we should not assume that there were none. Prior to 1851, we know that there were almost 24 African Americans who settled in the area that comprises present-day Johnson and Brown counties. Now, if you go back far enough, you find out how quickly these things break down, right? It's 1821 that you have Bartholomew County. Bartholomew County encompassed part of what is now Brown County. Monroe County had part of it. Jackson County had part of it. And a space that was known as Delaware County encompassed part of it. It was not until the 1830s that you begin to get the space that we now know as Brown County. So the records are hard to track because they are under different jurisdictions at different points. So the names that are listed for Johnson and Brown counties currently from the 1830s are obscured. We can't identify the names in a discrete fashion, but we know that there were at least 24. The numbers plummeted after 1850. To give you a contrasting example, in Columbus, Indiana, the population went from more than 50 Black residents to less than 5 people and remained in the single digits until after 1870. The reason, quite simply, is that if you were going to live in the county, and if you had been in the county prior to October 31st, 1852, then you had to pay a $500 fee in order to demonstrate that you would not be a drag on the public weal. This was a very intimidating thing that few people could do, right? It was also the case that there were Black people who were not listed in the public rolls for various reasons. And these are very interesting cases that are well worth pursuing. One is fugitive slaves. The Compromise of 1850 reinforced the laws that had been in existence since the 1780s and 1790s about fugitive slaves, but had been inconsistently enforced. But after 1850, it became a national concern, and compliance was required much more extensively. So there would have been fugitive slaves who would not have registered, right? Because they didn't qualify under any circumstances. They weren't free, and they were trying to evade slavery. There were people who scholars now refer to as Maroons, who were living in a kind of hinterland existence away from the settled areas, and who deliberately tried to stay out of the way of legal officials. And that is relevant to Brown County. So this is a photograph of a record from Bartholomew County from the Registry of Negroes and Mulattoes from 1853. This is how somebody shows up, if they exist, and if we are to know about them. This is the primary way that we would track Black settlers. This is for a man named John Blanks, who was a mulatto. He's identified as 6 feet high, has no hair on the top of his head where the hair ought to grow. The left wrist is crooked. His right big toe has been wounded with an axe, etc., etc. Right? Now, why would you want to know this information? These are visible characteristics that somebody could identify with a person. And all of this is verified by a man named Edward Hines, a citizen of Bartholomew County. Columbus, the 21st day of September, 1853, and the clerk of Bartholomew Circuit Court is making this document. There are 58 of these documents for the period up until 1862. That's how we know about any of the Black people of Bartholomew County during that period. But prior to 1852, more than 50 lived in a colony, as it was described, in Columbus on the banks of the Hall Creek. And after 1852, less than 10 are known to have lived in the entire county. Now, I use this as an example because it's near enough by that we can see some affinities, but there were still fewer in Brown County than in Bartholomew County. So for what purpose was this information collected? Visual characteristics were listed in order to make it possible to capture a person who may have been a fugitive. So in this case, the clerk of the circuit court described John Blanks in the ways that indicated. The Negro registries listed people who were not citizens and not eligible to participate as social equals in Bartholomew County or Jefferson County or any county in the state of Indiana. In 1843, there's an attempt to kill Frederick Douglass when he speaks in Pendleton. In 1861, Harriet Tubman speaks in Michigan City, and she's jailed, right? There was a clear effort to surveil, to punish, to try to keep out African Americans. As in all such systems, some people are not documented. There are exceptional cases. Someone who had not lived in the county prior to October 31st, 1852 as a free person might be a fugitive, might be in the process of being emancipated or subject to a prior contract of indenture. One of the ways that the founding fathers of Indiana tried to get around the rules of the Northwest Ordinance was by having very elaborate rules of indenture. So there were people who were indentured who were virtually slaves, and if not literally entitled to slaves. The code required that a white person be the testifying person for any kind of public record pertaining to free blacks. So these are fascinating cases if you're trying to understand the social history of the time. I'm not a social historian, but I'm fascinated by it. My friend Gene Sneed, a retiree from Cummins Engine Company who lives in Hardrick Township, Indiana, the two of us have been exploring the story of an African-American woman who is known to have lived with the family of the president of Hartsville College from 1852 to 1865 in the community of Hartsville. There are accounts, both retrospective and from the 1870s, retrospective from the early part of the 20th century and from the 1870s in newspapers that make it very clear that a colored woman lived in Hartsville during that period, in the home of President Shuck as part of a college community that had between 180 and 200 students of all ages during that time. She does not appear to have been hiding from the law, but she is not someone who would have been characterized as a free Negro according to the stipulations of 1852. So there is no document for her in the registry of Bartholomew County. Did the Shuck family try to evade the authorities? Well, apparently not, because it was an open secret. Was she someone who was regarded as an exception? Was she a dependent elderly person? There may be lots of possibilities. What we know, and this is marvelous, she was born in 1770. She died after Appomattox. She was still alive in 1865 and living in Kansas, and was in 1865 listed as a free person. But at the different points in her life, she may have had multiple kinds of existences. She was born in Virginia. She lived in an enslaved situation in Louisiana. And in 1852, she may have been in this limbo land, right? But in Bartholomew County, in a rural place where the nearest other African American may have been 15 miles away. I have an image for these kinds of quests, the quests for Black settlers of Brown County being among them. We're never going to have their pictures, right? We may acquire more information. We may learn more about what their life looked like. We may learn more about the social history. But in some senses, they have a kind of shadowy existence for us. And yet, it seems to me we dare not act as if they are entirely invisible. They lived. And so the quest is to bring them into greater visibility. This is from a photograph of a black settler in Marion County, Indiana, from the 1880s. And for a variety of reasons, I chose to use her. She may have been of mixed race, but she was from an African-American family. The person that I mentioned to you, who was born around the time of the Boston Massacre and was alive in July of 1865, her name was Mary Lattimore. And it's remarkable to think that there are enough stories about her that some people believe she was buried in Bartholomew County. To me, it's improbable because she's 95 years old and she's in Lecompton, Kansas. But the local story was that she lived and died a contented life. It's a very ironic statement because it's misspelled, and so it's in the text, it's Contended, contented life. But it is someone who we're discovering more about. We may yet discover things about her. Right now, we know she's not buried in a marked grave in Lecompton, and there's not a marked grave of her in Bartholomew County, but there are unmarked graves with the Shuck family in the Hartsville College Cemetery, and so it's possible. In 2023, there are no photographs of her, but we can recover some details about the life lived of this person, and we can make her more visible to us. And I think we can do the same thing with black settlers of Brown County. We know that Ephraim Manuel and James Warwick settled in Washington Township in the 1840s. And I believe it's Ephraim Manuel that Anna Elisa Cox is tracking in her studies. She doesn't name the person in Brown County. We know that these people, like John Blanks from Bartholomew County, were from North Carolina. And we know that they sold their land and returned to North Carolina in the early 1850s. So from 1850 to 1870, you will find no records of any African Americans in Brown County. They too vanished. Based on the documentary record of official records, these people came and left, but there are other indications that life may have been messier than the documentary categories of the Negro registers of that period. So Rhonda Dunn, who is one of those wonderful servants in Brown County doing historical research, I believe she's on vacation right now. She's not here, right? But she's the archivist at the Brown County History Center. And several years ago, when I embarked on this quest, she showed me an inquiry from the period from 1915 to 1925. This is from the period when the old settlers were wanting to find out who was the oldest settler still alive, right? Now, the old settlers had been around for about 50 years in 1925. So, it wasn't a new thing, but articles were written in the newspaper every year asking who's the oldest settler, because you get a prize if you're the oldest settler, right? And people wrote in to tell stories of the oldest settlers that they remembered. And one of the people wrote in and said, well, on Schooner Creek, there was this man named Jim Manuel, and he was black. And another person remembered a root woman named Yarrick, which appears to have been a corruption of the Warwick surname. Is it possible that two people who had the same names as settlers in the 1820s managed to continue living on the edges for 20 years or so? They were said to have a common law marriage relationship, And the root woman named Yark was also identified as Native American. To me, it's really fascinating that if you look at the map of Brown County and you look at where the 10 o'clock line is, and you look at where their property was or where they were living, it's right there, right? It's at the 10 o'clock line on Schooner Creek, if I understand the location right. So there are more documents being discovered on resources like FamilyWeb, Ancestry.com, newspapers.com. And Rhonda Dunn tells me that the two oldest books of public records that we now have pertaining to colored and white males are from 1877. And so they're available for research purposes. You can access the spreadsheet with an index of those names. And if you have a membership on FamilyWeb, you can go in and to your heart's content, you can go down and see all of those names. If you're interested in looking at these in other counties, Jefferson County has an awesome website. I mean, it's readily available there. So somebody who wanted to do the research that Mark Allen Furnish did on Eleutherian College from 2007 to 2014, today you could do that in a half hour. He spent weeks doing it in the early part of the 21st century. I'm no longer sure what the threshold for reasonable expectations for digital technologies are, but I do know that research that I did 40 years ago that took me weeks to do can now be done in a half hour if you're properly oriented and know how to use spreadsheets. I have to ask one of my 20 and 30 something children to assist me with some of this. But the quest to learn more about Black settlers is something I would encourage folks here in Brown County to do. Perhaps someday we will be able to say even more about the members of the Warwick and Manuel families who we believe lived in Washington Township. In the meantime, I think we can gain a deeper understanding of Brown County history, but we do need to be clear about what we're doing. It is more than the story of those who came and stayed. Rhonda Dunn said to me at one point, people in Brown County have historically been interested in those who stayed. Right? If you want to talk about Black settlers, you're going to have to talk about those who came and left because they had no choice. So naturally, we need to be more than self-satisfied in our quest. It's also the story of those who were not welcomed and those who were specifically not encouraged to be here. So you might call that a self-critical approach. It is also, and I think this is really hard to come to grips with, but very important to dwell with. It's the story of our constituted history. This is the way it was designed to be by those who did not want those people here. The story of the way our ancestors chose to change the ground rules for citizenship in order specifically to exclude. Property ownership defined a basis for citizenship initially, but by 1851, Hoosiers adopted the state constitution that disallowed Blacks from being citizens, period. And of course, the 1857 ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court made that true universally. Dred Scott decision is something that Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts says, if you want the lowest possible standard of failure of the Supreme Court Chief Justice, all you have to do is look at the Dred Scott decision and Roger Taney's leadership in that. It is the most shameful Supreme Court decision as per the current Chief Justice saying. So what do we know at this point? Just to summarize this, we know the names of 2 Black settler families. Manual and Warwick. They existed in 1850, both in Washington Township. We know that in the first quarter of the 20th century, there were at least a few people who remembered people of color having lived in Brown County. People who sent in their names as, for the oldest black settler. Between the period of 1850 and 1925, there is a gap in our knowledge. And that gap has everything to do with Jim Crow. That gap has everything to do with systematic racism. There are lots of words to describe it, but the sparse listings for the Negro and Mulatto Registry do not give us a lot of information to work with. But there's something there. And we ought to be engaged in the quest for public records. We also know that the records for Bartholomew County and Jefferson County permit us to draw some interesting comparisons. In other words, we know enough to continue the quest. So just a few interim notes on the need for more focused research, and I'll be done. A few members of the Manuel and Warwick families may have lived in isolated areas of Brown County for a period of years beyond the reach of census takers. So it would be really interesting to look at the coordinates where the property was owned and to explore further what was going on in that area, right? What was going on in that part of the county, what other kinds of settlements were going on, who was living there. It's not impossible to know exactly the plot of land because, of course, it's the 1/4 part of the section, right? We have these things. At least there are reports that other old settlers remember folks doing so in the lower and upper Schooner Creek areas. It's possible that these oral history recollections are inaccurate, but it's also striking that they would surface in the context of an invitation to remember who the old settlers were. If there is a self-satisfied version of telling the story of Brown County that is all white, then a systematic effort would just be to completely whitewash it and not remember anybody. But people actually remembered, right? And so what do you do with that oral history? It may be wrong. It may be confused, just as the fact that they remember the Yark woman as being a root woman, being a Native American, being black. What's with that? She's remembered as a person of color, regardless of how you categorize it. And I would encourage folks to explore other records, starting with the Index for Adult Males for listings of white and colored persons from 1847 to 1943. If you're going to look into this, that's where you would start. And since December, that information has been available online in ways that it wasn't before. Rhonda Dunn tells me that during their Christmas party, somebody from the auditor's office brought over the book and handed it to the person who was putting all that online for when Family Web. So it's literally being made available to us in our time. So the opportunities for future exploration are there, and I would say whatever their origins, people of color were among the earliest settlers of Brown County. That's true if you want to think about the people who were trying to defend the boundary line of the 10 o'clock line, and it's true for the people who were settlers, black and white alike, who came in after the 10 o'clock line was violated. I would remind you that this quest is intergenerational. The inquiry that was launched a few years ago in the context of the collaboration between Rachel Perry and Joe Schroeder was a good example of this. I admire greatly the way Rachel worked with Joe, from what I can tell from reading articles. There was a partnership there. There was a sharing of skills. Other people could sponsor these kinds of inquiries. The Brown County Historical Society could work with high school students to carry out such inquiries. Some of these could be initiated by students who might then enlist the help of Brown County Historical Society members as assistants or mentors. And others could be launched by seniors with students serving as junior researchers. And they could even present any new discoveries at future Juneteenth celebrations. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, solutions? Yes, sir.
Just one thing, even the so-called free slaves were not free.
Right.
They had to pay to leave the state. So it goes on down. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The state pays
The state of Indiana, every year that the legislature was in session in the 19th century, indicated its active support for colonization efforts. And there were people who thought of themselves as emancipationists who wanted slavery to end, but they wanted to end by the means of exporting African Americans. So that $500 fine was supposed to be directed at the cost of leaving. Right? So yeah, there was never freedom with social equality, never freedom with rights of citizenship, but there was technical freedom without equality. Yes, others? Yes, sir.
In some of the things I've looked at, a lot of communities in Indiana ceased to exist around 1900. Have you looked at anything that would have caused that time to be a time that people sold their land and migrated out of Indiana?
I don't know. I do know from conversations with Charlie Rauch and other people that, you know, by the turn of the century, they had hunted out all the deer in Brown County, right? So, you know, they had, the trees were gone, the deer were gone. So the livelihood may have collapsed in some of these places. Charlie Rauch tells the story that his father was part of the crew that brought in the first group of 8 deer into Brown County in the 1930s. And by the early 1950s, they had ordered mandatory hunts again. To me, it is very hard to take that in. You know, I can go over to the House of the Singing Winds and read the information about the condition of the hillsides when T.C. Steele was there. But it's just very hard to grasp the ways in which the landscape was transformed by I don't know that you can call it clear cutting. You know, it was just an unrestrained gobbling up the resources. So to me, there are lots of different causes about that, but no doubt racism is in the mix for that. Others, yes.
What was a root woman?
I think somebody who knew how to use plants for medicinal purposes is the context that I read. But somebody who learned that by living in the wild. And so the description, although very, very, very brief that I read, indicated somebody who had a kind of folk wisdom, and the kind of folk wisdom that some people at that time would associate with Native Americans, right? But it also may be people knew her because they went to her to get the right roots. Yes?
Did Hornberger ever photograph African Americans?
Oh my goodness, I've never thought about that. The Lilly Library would surely know if And that's another amazing thing, is you can get any of the Hohenberger photographs and you can pay a fee and, a couple dollars and have access to it. It's amazing.
Well, he
Yes.
wouldn't have been till 1917.
I'm sorry?
Hohenberger wouldn't have been here till 1917.
Right.
Thank you for that
Quite a bit
clarification.
later.
Jim?
Hohenberger also photographed Black people in other counties, which I found was interesting, but I haven't seen any from Brown County. So I kind of assumed that if there were in Brown County, he sure would have photographed.
An interesting question that has come up for me just in the last week is, where would you look if you were going to look for Black people in Brown County at a given period? And do any of you know the little community of Peogue?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. In 1925, right above the article about the old settlers, is an article about a gathering of 1,000 African Americans at a park called Idlewild Park, that was purchased by African Americans for African Americans, and 1,000 people came together for amusement at that location. And there's a reporting of what took place. This is what they ate, and some of that is stereotyped. They ate watermelon and so on. But, it's describing colored people having a good time in Peogue. Now, I have no idea what happened to Idlewild Park, but something that a group of people bought that's right across the line from Johnson County. And that's the way it's described. Johnson County being one of the strongholds of the KKK. It's fascinating that would be a Brown County space where you would have a concentrated number of Black people, and that would be on the periphery, right? It's way up there, away from Nashville, right? It's also fascinating to me what's going on when a group of people are at the Schultz's house. Well, the Schultz's are away, Schultz being the artist, and they have a cross burning party.
Well, so I always thought it was because it was very visible to everyone in the town.
So you think location is the matter?
Yes.
I'm just fascinated as to what is that gesture supposed to mean if there are no Black people? What is that doing? What kind of speech act is that? It's having some kind of intimidating attempt, but
Celebrating or.
I don't think that's what the United Methodist Cross and Flame is about. Jim?
I don't know if this was the same cross burning, but on Christmas Eve, the KKK went in to the Christmas Eve service at the Methodist Church and presented an offering and were embraced and applauded, and then went and burnt a cross.
That's the same one. That's the same.
The same
I
one.
just cut that out of my.
Yeah. That's the same one.
Yeah.
But
So
it was really accepted at that time.
Yeah, and these would have been very close spaces because the Methodist Church at that time would have been where the old phone company building is on Jefferson Street. So just not very far away from. Other questions, comments, or solutions? Well, thank you for participating in this second